Hello and good afternoon. I'm CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs, Ben Pendergrass, and I'm glad you guys could join us for our breakout session around permitting reform. I'm really pleased that Xan Fishman from the Bipartisan Policy Center is here to join us to talk about permitting reform for clean energy projects. Xan is the Director of Energy Policy and Carbon Management for the Bipartisan Policy Center. And before that, he was John Delaney's Chief of Staff for many years. And as many of you might recall, Congressman Delaney was one of the first leaders on carbon pricing over on the House side and was a pivotal voice in getting the Energy Innovation Act introduced. So we have a long history with Xan, and I'm very happy he could join us here today. Just to start off, Xan, some people might not be familiar with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Do you want to just give a brief overview of your organization? I have to say, full disclosure, my old boss, Senator Domenici, did go to work for the Bipartisan Policy Center as soon as he retired, so it does have a special place in my heart.
That's right. He was a big leader back in the budget fights of the last decade, if people remember. So thanks for having me here. Thanks for inviting me to talk about permitting, Ben. It's a really important topic, and it's just a pleasure to be talking to Citizens Climate Lobby. I have to say, back when I was a Hill staffer, I could not possibly have been more impressed by the organization and the motivation and the knowledge of the people that would continually come to my office and talk on behalf of the Citizens Climate Lobby. You were always great partners. Now I'm at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the Bipartisan Policy Center, as the name might give a hint, is a think tank. We're an organization in Washington, D.C. that's very mission based around finding consensus on ideas that can improve people's lives. And sometimes that's frustrating. A lot of politics these days is partisan. At the same time, there are a lot of members on both sides of the aisle that are looking for ways to make progress. And we often act as a convener, as a soundboard for ideas. We host events and highlight leaders who are working across the aisle on important topics. We help forge that consensus. And then at the end of the day, we go out there and pound the pavement, much like you do, which is, I think, so impressive about Citizen Climate Lobby, to try to make it actually happen. So that's the Bipartisan Policy Center. And there's, we have an energy team, which I'm on, energy and climate. There are about 15 of us on that team. So thanks for inviting me here.
Well, really appreciate it, and certainly given your focus on finding common ground and bipartisan solutions, I think you could say like we're kind of natural partners to work on some of these issues. So really appreciate it. I hope today we'll have kind of a dialogue around permitting reform and a conversation, and we'll kick it off here for about 20 minutes, and then we'll give everybody a chance to ask some of their questions they might have after a little bit here. But let me just to start things off, BPC has really been one of the first organizations to lean in to the permitting reform issue. I think you guys kind of got there, saw the need for it before other people did. And why did you guys really zero in on that and think that this is something that Congress needed to take action on, and that you really needed to start thinking about what some of those policies should be? Would be a great place to start this conversation.
Part of it has to do with BPC's past, and part of it has to do with a lot of forward thinking. In terms of the past, BPC had a very robust infrastructure program that had previously looked at permitting mostly as it related to surface transportation, roads, bridges, rail, that sort of things, and had built up a degree of expertise in permitting. And as our team was thinking about what the future of energy policy looked like, we basically came to the realization that we were pretty confident that the money was going to be there to create the incentives to build clean energy infrastructure, through a mix of public incentives and private capital. And we were pretty confident that the technology was going to be there through a mix of public funding for, R&D, as well as private sector investment in, the full innovation life cycle from, lab stuff to pilot projects, demonstration projects, to full scale commercialization. What we were absolutely not at all confident of is that we would be allowed to build technology here in our country. And that's what actually keeps me up at night when I'm thinking about, are we going to decarbonize or not? The money's there now, right? We were right about that. The infrastructure bill passed. Now the Inflation Reduction Act passed. So we've got money for deployment. We've got money for research. We've got incentives to build wind and solar and hydropower and geothermal and advanced nuclear and on and on and on, carbon capture. What we don't have is a permitting system that allows us to build those things in time to reach net zero by 2050, right? We can probably build those things in time to reach net zero by 2080, but we build too slowly. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And one of the things I want to just get in people's minds are that our permitting process is slow, and we just unleashed a huge amount of capital and incentives to build more. And what we're going to get if we don't improve our permitting is just a bigger and bigger and bigger backlog of projects not being built that are just in the permitting process, rather than an actual acceleration of projects being built. And the goal is to build a lot of clean infrastructure. So that's why we honed in on it so early. And what we did is about almost 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago, we put together a task force, a bipartisan task force. One of those was my old boss, John Delaney. Another person was Julian Castro, who was former Housing and Urban Development Secretary, Cabinet Secretary under President Obama. We also had former Senator Rick Santorum, former Governor Bobby Jindal, a former FERC Commissioner, Colette Honorable, and a current County Commissioner in Florida, Bill Truix. And so those people had experience at local government, at state government, at Cabinet Secretary level, House of Representatives, Senate, and like FERC administration of the broad scope of where these problems happen, how to fix them. And even though we had someone way to the left like Julian Castro and way to the right like Rick Santorum, we were able to get that group to agree on 23 specific recommendations to improve permitting for clean energy infrastructure. And they got, pretty granular, and some of them were, a nice step forward, right? And some of them were a nice hop forward, and others would, maybe get us closer to a run. A few of those recommendations ended up in that bipartisan infrastructure bill. The Inflation Reduction Act didn't have any policy changes related to permitting because it was a reconciliation bill and couldn't have policy changes, but it did have funding for agency staff, technology, training for permitting. And so there has been some progress made, but the infrastructure bill actually made more permitting progress for surface transportation than it did for energy projects.
Well, I think that's a good point that I don't think people know, that when they did pass the big infrastructure bill, it did include some permitting reform for those infrastructure projects, not clean energy infrastructure. But we've been here before, and we've actually done some of this permitting reform to make it easier to build the stuff we need.
That's right. That's right. And some of the things that people are talking about now is merely giving energy projects parity with, roads and bridges.
I mean, I think, and this is coming up a lot in the chat, and you certainly paint a very compelling picture of like why you guys got there first and really started thinking about this, because yeah, you're right. There's now a lot more money. I think more than many of us ever thought would be possible that Congress would approve for some of these projects. And now it's really about getting steel in the ground. I think Senator Schatz makes a really compelling argument when he talks about, for generations, the idea around environmental movements was to stop the building of stuff. And now when it comes to climate, we have to rethink our approach to that and think, how can we build things faster?
That's exactly right. Like what is a win? Like when you go to sleep at night and you think back on your day, like what's going to make you feel better about yourself? Like in the past, it often was, if you were an environmentalist in the past, it often was stopping some dirty project. In the future, it's got to be building the clean stuff.
Absolutely.
Because right now we have the status quo, right? We always have the status quo, whatever the right now is, right? And the question you have to ask yourself about permitting reform is the status quo good or is the status quo bad? Right now, the status quo is not good. And so the question is, how easy are we going to make it to change the status quo, or are we going to keep, inertia, keep doing what we're doing?
I mean, I think, and you might have a good number off the top of your head. I know we're expanding our transmission capacity just a little, around 1% now. And I think to reach our targets, we've got to double and even possibly triple that in the coming years. You can tell me if I'm right about that.
Yeah. So transmission. Let me talk a little bit about. Well, I'll start answer your question and then I'll broaden from there. We need to build transmission at give or take an increase of 2.4% a year to hit climate targets. Right now we're building it at 1% a year, just like you said. That's exactly right. And if everyone remembers when people were talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, they did a lot of modeling about what the emissions reductions would be from all those new clean energy tax credits. Mm-hmm. That modeling assumed a faster pace of transmission. If you instead assume a static rate of transmission, then you lose 80% of the emissions reductions from those clean energy tax credits. That means the Inflation Reduction Act will only be 20% as good as we want it to be if we can't build transmission faster.
But I think, and I'll get on to other things, but I think this is important that people understand is, I don't think there's a wide understanding that we could remove fossil fuels from the mix tomorrow. We just wouldn't have the amount of power generation we need to get to replace those energy inputs in our homes and our vehicles. And so this is part of the idea of, like, if you're going to electrify everything, you've got to do all these things and do it fast.
Well, if there's one thing there's a million things I wanted to give you as takeaways, but one thing that you should keep in your mind when you're thinking about the concept of electrification is that electrification is not synonymous with decarbonization. It can be a very useful tool, but electrification without a big expansion of the transmission grid would actually increase emissions. Why is that? Is because most of our renewable resources, wind and solar, are in the center of the country. That's, we've got excellent geography in the center of our country for wind and solar. Most of our people and businesses are on the coasts. So if we want to produce a whole lot more renewable energy, most of that will happen in the center of the country. And we're going to need to get that energy to the coasts. The only way to do that is through transmission lines. Electrification means that we are using the electric grid for more than we're currently using it for, right? Right now, we use the electric grid for, things that have electricity, our refrigerators, our lights in our houses. Most people don't use it for vehicles, right? Most people still have cars and they use gasoline, and that is not a load on the electric grid, right? Most people have, natural gas furnace or stove and range, or, there's electric ranges too, but, you think about all these things, the more that gets electrified, the more electricity we're going to need. And with transmission, that can be really clean. Without transmission, then we're going to use more coal, more natural gas, or if we're really lucky, more advanced nuclear. But it's really hard to cite advanced nuclear as well, as I'm sure you're aware.
Well, I'm sure this is getting to the kind of the core of the issue. I know that people have these questions, like, in your view, what are the reforms that are really needed? Like, what are the top priority things? What do we need Congress to be thinking about and putting in place as they think about what are these barriers and how we change the way we do permit these clean energy projects? And I have to say, like, for energy, the permitting process is the same whether it's fossil fuel or clean energy. So they kind of go together. For certain things, obviously, gas pipelines and things like that have a different process than electric transmission. But when we're talking about permitting for energy projects, it's kind of like the whole bucket. But
yeah, I'm gonna slightly disagree with you there. Only to make the point that our current permitting system is actually easier for fossil fuels than it is for renewables. So, when we're thinking about should we keep our permitting system the way it is or should we make changes, I think it's worth knowing that it is easier to cite a transmission line than it is to cite. Sorry, it is easier to cite a natural gas pipeline than it is to cite a transmission line. It is easier to drill for oil than it is to drill for geothermal.
That's a really good point that I think is lost a lot of times.
So your question is what can we do about it? Which is a great question. What can we do about it? One point that I would want to say at the outset is that our permitting system is about a process. It's about a process that you follow to make sure that whatever it is that you're going to build is going to provide benefits and ideally not cause a lot of harm, right? That's the ideal scenario. You want a permitting process so that you don't accidentally put something in a place where it's going to cause real harm to the environment, to habitats, to people who live nearby. That's a really good goal. We have environmental standards, and we should keep our environmental standards. Permitting reform doesn't require changing environmental standards. What it requires is changing the process by which we check and make sure that we're upholding our environmental standards. So a statistic that would be worth knowing is that, the big complicated projects that we have in the US have to go through what's called an EIS, an environmental impact statement. And the average time that takes right now is like 4.5 years. That's the average, right? So that means a lot of them are taking more than 6 years.
Yep.
So, I don't know. I should have probably just started by asking you to think in your head, how long do you think the permitting process should take for an energy project? And, I suspect that you would have given some answer between 6 months and a year. The reforms that are on the table from both Senator Manchin, which we can talk more about, and from Senator Capito, the Democrat and Republican, are to get that down to 2 years, from 4.5 to 2. And in my mind, 2 years is a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's enough time to do a thorough review. No one should be scared about the idea that we're going from 4.5 years down to 2. Right? It's not like we're going to do it in 60 days and people are going to be running around the offices with papers flying everywhere and trying to book flights and get your survey everything. It's 2 years. It's a long time. But that would more than double our pace, right? It would actually be meaningful. Some of the stuff is simple, like just deadlines, real deadlines. Everyone at work understands the concept of deadlines. Like if you don't give someone a deadline, a lot of times people just take longer and longer and longer and longer. Deadlines are useful. They're internally motivating. So that I think would be a really big, important one. Transmission, I'm going to keep coming back to transmission because in many ways it's like the most important piece of it. Because even if we can build solar faster and we can build wind faster and all these things, if we don't have the transmission, it's just going to, not provide power. So it's not going to actually get built. Transmission is hard because it's really long, right? It goes through lots of different states. It goes through different communities. And so you have to, look along the entire path. So the siting is difficult. And a lot of times not all the states are working well together or, playing ball, particularly because sometimes the electricity is going from one place through another place to an in place. And those through other places have less motivation to agree to the transmission. And in that case, there needs to be a federal component, to authority to site the transmission, which is what we don't have right now, but we do have for natural gas pipelines. So, a lot of this is just giving transmission, in this case, parity with what natural gas already has. And the other piece of it is cost allocation. When you're building a big transmission line, you want to allocate the costs to the people who are benefiting, which those benefits are fairly dispersed. So, more federal authority to make sure that happens can help speed transmission lines. Do you want me to just keep going? We can go kind of on and on.
Those are some really good points. I know, I know we're about halfway through now. And if people want to chat their questions directly to Bill Barron, I think he should have renamed himself to something like chat questions towards me. And then Bill can kind of start to get those in order. And I'll ask Xan one more question, and then we'll start trying to get through some of your guys' questions, because I've seen there's a lot of questions. This is a topic that I think has a lot of interest, and we're all going to have to do a lot of education. And so just maybe a quick flip of that. You got in some of the most important stuff, but what are the things that are probably that people throw out there that probably sound good, but really wouldn't be that effective to speed up this permitting process?
There are some people who really focus on the number of pages in an environmental impact statement. They've gotten really long over time, because it's people being more and more careful. What used to be a 10-page environmental impact statement sometimes is now a 600-page environmental impact statement. And there have been proposals to keep them 200 pages or less. I don't think that would be bad. I'm not as convinced that it would be as meaningful. The biggest category I would say is, you want, at the end of the day, we want our projects to work well and not harm people or habitats or places. And so the things that really actually bypass all review and could result in something being built that really shouldn't be built and causing a big backlash against building more things, that's the stuff that I worry about, right? Now, at the same time, one of the things that would be really good is more categorical exclusions. There are certain things that we really understand really well. Sometimes they're smaller, sometimes we've just done them, 1,000 times. And we know, because we've studied them so many times, that thing is it's not a risk. And when that happens, you can give it a categorical exclusion. And the project sponsor can say, we're doing this exact thing that has a categorical exclusion. And we're looking at the location we want to build it. And we're going to make sure there's no extraordinary circumstances that would somehow change it. And if there's no extraordinary circumstances, then your review is super fast. That would be a really good thing. That's actually a thing that the administration can do on their own, though both Capito and Manchin have it in their bills to kind of force the administration to do it. And it was actually really good news is that 3-4 weeks ago, the administration actually put out a request for information for new categorical exclusions that they should consider, which I was really, really happy to see.
Well, I think we can turn over. I do want to you brought up something that I think is really important to us and to our volunteers, is the need to continue to protect communities and to make sure projects that would have harms don't get built. And I think if you could just spend 45 seconds on that before we dive into more questions from the chat.
Right. So faster review, more efficient permitting is or should not be synonymous with building everything that gets reviewed, right? The review is still supposed to be a review, and there still be good standards. And if things don't meet that standards, the answer should be no and not yes. When I think about protecting communities, advancing environmental justice, from my perspective, building clean energy should contribute to helping communities, to advancing environmental justice, right? Less pollution, more local economic benefits, cheaper energy, right? All these are things to help people. So it should not be the case that permitting efficiency, permitting reform, is somehow antithetical to advancing environmental justice.
I think that's a good point. Bill, do you want to grab some of the questions from the chat and read them to us?
Sure. Thanks for this conversation. It's very, very interesting. We have a bunch of questions. I'll start here with, could you go over the reasons for the permitting system being so slow and what would be potentially given up environmentally to speed up the process? Do we risk diluting or damaging environmental justice by speeding up the process?
The goal is that we wouldn't, is that we have a process that's more efficient. You can come to a yes more quickly, or you can come to a no more quickly. Like that should be what our system is, right? It should be about efficiency. Again, a permitting is about a process. Processes can be made more efficient without making the thing you're doing worse.
And I think something that Xan kind of touched on earlier, that one thing that was included in the IRA was a lot more money for the departments to staff up and get more of the personnel they need to review permits faster. And so any permitting reform could really be complementary to now what we've already put in place to give them that ability to review things in a more speedy time frame.
Great, thanks for that. What would you say is the breakdown for federal, state, county, and city authority for permitting? Will state and local permitting be a part of what? Well, this is a question for us in CCL. What will support? But curious what the breakdown looks like to you.
It is an absolutely terrific question. I'm not sure I can give you a percentage breakdown, but each level of government has a role to play, and the federal government cannot do it all. States are really important. Local governments are really important. A couple of the reforms that we have suggested. One is a greater use of memoranda of understanding. So at the beginning of a process, federal government, state, local government, project sponsor can all agree, this is going to be our joint collective process. We're going to work in coordination with each other and not duplicate our work. And we're going to all adhere to a set of previously agreed upon timelines. Something like that is actually more helpful than you would think. One of the reforms that federally is just getting all of the agencies to work together. You would think, oh, it's the federal government. They all work together, but the truth is that they don't. Sometimes a project needs 5 separate agencies to do things. And the way historically has been, one agency does something, then they pass it on to the next agency that duplicates, half of that work, and then passes it on to the next agency that duplicates half of that work again, and then disagrees with the first agency. And actually just having the agencies work together from the get-go is actually really helpful. Just basic coordination.
And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but that was provisions basically dictating that would have been included in the Manchin proposal earlier this year.
That's correct. It's kind of referred to as one federal decision. Basically getting the government to work together. The other thing I'll say is that we have thought that it would be important to somehow either create a stick or a carrot to get state governments to do better. So either give them a financial incentive to improve their own processes that they can use to hire staff and create, better permitting systems locally, or, some have suggested a stick. Like if your permitting is slower and is slowing the things down, you could lose access to the funding.
Thanks so much for that. I have an interesting, this sounds like a standard question we'd hear, but it seems ideal to tighten permitting requirements for fossil fuel projects while streamlining permitting for clean energy infrastructure. Can permitting reform be structured to only facilitate renewable energy transmission?
I think the answer is politically no. In order to have something get through Congress, it's going to need 60 votes in the Senate, right? And that is just true. You can't do this through reconciliation, right? So in some imagined world where Democrats took the House back again and we got 53 Democratic senators, a reconciliation bill wouldn't be able to pass the policies to do it, right? A reconciliation bill can only handle money flows, right? Tax incentives, spending, not policy changes. So just politically, the answer is no. But the other thing, as I say, is that I honestly don't think that we should worry about that much. The market has already decided we are going to decarbonize. The incentives are in place to decarbonize. Last year, 77% of new electricity generation in the United States was either wind or solar, just wind or solar. That's not the other kinds of clean electricity. 77% last year. That was before the Inflation Reduction Act was, started. That's before any of those incentives came online. So we're going to decarbonize. At the same time, we're not going to stop using fossil fuels tomorrow or next year. There's a role, for instance, for natural gas. Right now Europe has a huge crisis in energy, and people are going to massively suffer unless they have natural gas. Not every country has good renewable resources, and so if U.S. natural gas can displace coal abroad, that is a decarbonizing action. And there's even new technologies called Allen-Felt cycle natural gas power plants that can turn natural gas power plant into more than 99% clean, which would be a huge advance. If we can replace a coal plant in Africa with one of these natural gas plants, the net effect globally for emissions would just be tremendous. And so, what I would say is that, politically, the only way forward is an all of the above approach. And the truth is that an all of the above approach is consistent with decarbonization.
Yeah, and I think one thing that comes up that I think is also important to cite is, in at least the permitting reform we're talking about, we're not saying NEPA no longer needs to be there, or the Clean Water Act needs to be repealed. Those environmental standards we want to protect. I think Xan said it really well. Always keeps talking about the process. We're not saying oh no, you no longer need to worry about clean water. It's just making these decisions faster. I think that's a really important point to make when people are concerned about this.
Great. Next question. This has been asked a number of times in the chat. Does the National Climate Adaptation and Resilience Strategy Act bill help with increased efficiency for permitting?
I can take that one, Xan. That's something we work on.
Good.
Yeah, NCARS does not. That is about government coordination around responding to natural disasters and kind of making government get on the same page. But it does not have a permitting reform component for at least, especially not for energy.
Is it possible to provide economic incentives to people who will be impacted by the transmission lines? A complicated question, but wondered if it would help to address the not in my backyardism.
Absolutely. I could answer this for transmission, but I can answer this for energy projects, writ large. A good path forward, a lot of times, is to use what's called a community benefit agreement, where you go to the community in advance and you say, this is the project we want to build, and here's why we want to build it, and here's how it's going to help you. It's going to provide jobs, or it's going to provide it's going to decrease local pollution by switching from, one fuel source to a different fuel source, or clean up the air. But those community benefit agreements can include lots of things. Sometimes they include improving local roads. Sometimes they improving local schools and hospitals and green spaces. Sometimes there are local benefits to individuals through cheaper power. Those are the kinds of things that can be provided and negotiated up front, just depending on the circumstance.
Great. Another question. Can you explain why it's difficult to site advanced nuclear? My understanding is that small modular reactors could be installed in old coal plants, which could take advantage of the existing grid transmission lines.
Oh, such a great question. Yes. Coal to nuclear is a really exciting, new concept. And the questioner hit it right on the money, is that a lot of the things that you need for a coal plant are the same things that you need for a nuclear plant, right? You want to basically a way to heat water to create steam to turn turbines, right? So a lot of the people who work on one could work on the other. And almost most importantly, you have existing transmission lines. And as I've discussed, new transmission lines are hard. So reusing existing transmission lines for a coal plant that's going to be shutting down is really great. And so there is a lot of potential there. There's a lot of potential there. At the same time, we've been slow to site nuclear, traditional nuclear in particular, and advanced nuclear is still a thing of the future. And I think we're getting close. We've got a lot of interesting, cool projects in the pipeline. And I'm very hopeful that this decade they're going to get deployed. There's a really good example in Wyoming that's doing just that. It's using existing transmission lines from coal to add in a advanced nuclear site. TerraPower, I think, is the company that's doing that there. But the last thing I'll say is that outside of normal permitting, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, that is responsible for the regulations around the go or no go on can you build this nuclear facility, is a whole separate issue. It's been very difficult, and I think the NRC came online in the 70s, and we haven't built a new nuclear plant since they did. So there's more to do there.
Great. This may be out of the context of what we're talking about, but it has come up as far as what permitting reform is needed to speed up distributed generation installation.
Well, I think it's just permitting writ large for that one. There's different kinds of things that apply at different scale, right? Like big complicated things need that EIS that I said, takes 4.5 years, and we're trying to get down to 2. For things that are less big and complicated, a lot of times those will get what's called an EA, an environmental assessment. Those often take several years. The goal is to get those down to 1 year. Some things get a categorical exclusion, but especially for things that end up just distributed. The more distributed they are, the more players there end up being. So that basic coordination role, again, is really important. Just forcing the coordination.
And then you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think right now it's a lot harder for wind projects than it is for solar, as general rule, just given their different technical specifications. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, it just depends. Wind and solar have more recently been facing local ordinances that basically ban them, which is another thing to keep one's eye on. Like there's a really good paper written by our organization called ClearPath about wind in Iowa, and the name of the paper is called Hawkeye Headwinds. And what they basically found is that the more wind has been added in Iowa, which there's a bunch of, the more local counties have put barriers to new wind.
Excellent. Another question here. How do we address lawsuits, sometimes frivolous, that can cause huge delays in the permitting?
The judicial review is the piece that I haven't talked about yet because it's so tricky, but it's absolutely important. You know, a lot of times people ask, why is it so much harder here in the US than in other countries that we think of as having high environmental standards? And the answer is a lot of that judicial review. In the US, anybody can sue anybody anytime, right? And court cases can cause major delays. People have proposed various solutions to that. Some have proposed, you know, only limiting standing to people directly affected, only limiting standing to people who submitted public comments during the early stages, decreasing the statute, you know, decreasing the amount of time after a decision that one has to file a lawsuit. You know, like kind of a worst case scenario is like you get your approval, you spend 18 months building your thing, and then all of a sudden there's a lawsuit that, you know, stops you when you've built 80% of the thing and you've invested a bunch of money, and now you've got this whole new lawsuit that's going to stops you when you delays time. So yeah, judicial review, big problem, a little harder to solve, basically because in the US we kind of like our freedoms to file suit.
Super. Well, we have just a few minutes left in this session. And the last question I have for you is, what would you say to the person who says we don't need permitting reform? We just need more people employed in the sector to get the EIS done?
I would say that this is a scenario where, yeah, I'm just going to say more people in the sector. I'm going to basically have that be equivalent to money, right? Throwing money at the problem of permitting is necessary, but not sufficient. We absolutely need more staffers focusing on this. We absolutely need them to use updated technology. We absolutely need them to be trained on that updated technology. You know, a lot of, you know, geospatial mapping that we have these days can really speed some of these decisions up because we actually have a lot of data. You can compare the data, but without a deadline, people act as if there's no deadline. And without, you know, requirements for coordination, it has always been the case in our federal government, whether the president has been a Republican or the president has been a Democrat, that agencies butt heads and they don't always work well together. And so I would say that there are policy reforms that are needed, and some that, you know, affect states. So for instance, like one of the things that people are talking about for natural gas pipelines, I'm just using this as an example, is that some people use a Clean Water Act provision for states to block a natural gas pipeline, and they're doing it based on emissions. That's not water related. There are other things that can look at emissions, right? The Clean Water Act isn't an emissions related thing. And so the question is, should the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act that states are able to use there be narrowed to only things that are affecting water? And we have other policies to think about emissions. That's the kind of thing that you can talk about there.
Well, I think that's a really great question to end on. And I think obviously Bipartisan Policy Center has a lot of smart people thinking about these issues, Xan being one of them. And so I really appreciate that he took the time out of his Saturday to join us and field a bunch of questions. I think this is a enormously important topic that we're going to be doing. I encourage everybody to take some of the trainings that we put on. Dana Nucitelli's training on the need for permitting reform is really useful. I recommend everybody watch that first. And as we take on these bigger expanded policy agenda, expect to get more educational materials from us that I hope will help answer a lot of these questions. I think we can all say thank you to Xan. And again, really appreciate it, Xan, and taking the time today. And I appreciate everybody who took the time to come to this breakout session to learn a little bit more about the need for permitting reform and how we might do it.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's such an important topic. I'm so glad you're talking about it, and I'm so glad you are talking about it, because CCL is an impressive organization, and I am very confident that as an organization you'll be able to move people on this issue.
Thanks so much, Xan. Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.